behind schedule by.
Our next agenda item is number 5. It's an ordinance concerning 5420 West John Cannon Drive zoning map amendments. And Nick and Nick are joining us. So Nick, other Nick, if you would introduce this topic, and then John, I assume you're the primary planner on this.
Yes.
And so Nick.
If it's all right with you, can we just turn it over to John, since this is one the council had approved, helping to speed up the early advertising.
Right.
So John's done the primary work on it, so we'll let him introduce
Okay,
it.
that's fine. Thanks, John.
Thank you. And I can tell the applicants are very grateful for your willingness to speed that up. So you can see on the map here, this is a project. It's in the northwest quadrant. It's located west of the airport and north of the International Center. The request on the table is to change the zoning from AG, or agriculture, to M1, or light manufacturing, and to remove the lowland conservancy overlay district from the property. The goal is to, of course, develop the property as some sort of industrial facility in the future. This may sound really familiar because the council recently approved the exact same changes on some properties that are literally adjacent to it to the south. The existing AG zone, it doesn't really allow any sort of development on the property other than limited agricultural uses. You can see where the shading is on the map. That indicates where the overlay district is, and that overlay district is even more difficult. You can't really you can't develop anything except for some sort of recreational types of facilities. This request was reviewed by Public Utilities. They agreed that the overlay should be moved. There's no waterways or ponds, wetlands on the property that are present, and the goal of the overlay district is to protect those types of facilities. The Northwest Quadrant Master Plan does support development on this site as light industrial. The boundary between the natural area and the developable area is actually that north property line where that Goggin drain flows through. And if you can see right on the north side of there, you can start to see there's a lot of water, wetlands, and those sort of things that should be protected by the overlay district.
John, just for clarity,
Yes.
the master plan draws that boundary as the north property line.
Yes,
Okay,
it does.
Thanks.
The request received a unanimous positive recommendation from the Planning Commission. We haven't received any negative comments from the public. So I'll just leave it up to you if you have any questions for me. Mr. Romney is here as well, and he would be happy to answer any questions if you have any for him.
Questions or comments, council members? Looks like we're good.
Okay.
This, we did an early advertising on this, so even though we're setting the date tonight in our consent agenda for a public hearing on the 25th, we're in compliance with our notification because we advertised early on it. So I think we're good to go.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Item number 6 is an ordinance fine-tuning of the zoning code amendments. Nick and Nick. And Daniel, welcome.
You sound so disappointed about that.
Nick and Nick? No, I kind of like that, actually. Color coordinate.
Same haircut would be awesome.
The same haircut would be awesome.
Get that done next time. We'll probably let Daniel just jump into this. This is a very simple yet complicated item, so we'll just let him take care of the
Okay, Daniel.
what it is.
There's a setup for you. Simple yet complicated item.
Well, I hope not. So this is a request to fix a number of issues that have been identified in the zoning code. These are generally very minor changes to the code that make it better, easier to administrate, make certain processes and regulations more clear that there have been questions about. So again, there's 17 changes to the code, generally all minor. Don't really have a presentation to go over every single one of them. But I just want to note up front that because of recently adopted changes to the code, we're going to have to make some little tweaks to it before we take it to the public hearing. But
You will be making some modifications before the public hearing.
correct.
Well,
Just some little technical changes because we recently adopted changes to the TSA land use tables that didn't incorporate these changes. So
Just making sure that there's no conflicts
Everything's
in
consistent.
codes. And that doesn't necessarily have to be before the public hearing, just before you make a decision on it.
Before the final
Yeah.
decision, okay. Questions or comments? No questions or comments. So it was relatively simple, although complicated. So thank you very much. We'll be setting the date for the hearing this evening on our consent agenda for August 8th and potentially taking action on August 29th. And Daniel, if you have those modifications, the sooner you can get those to us, the better, even if it's prior to the public hearing, because we like to have the public have that information accessible when they comment. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Council members, we're just a little bit ahead of schedule, so we're taking a break now. And so if we could take a break and reconvene at 4 o'clock, we'll be talking about our benchmarking and market transparency ordinance. Okay? All right. Come back at 4. Welcome back. We are on agenda item number 8, which is an ordinance, building benchmarking and market transparency ordinance. Lehua Weaver is the council staff for this, so I'm going to let you introduce it and then any other staff information we may have.
Great. The council may remember having a briefing on this item earlier in the year. And based on the feedback that the administration has received, there are several changes that have been made to the proposal. So I'll actually let Debbie walk through those changes and review that with the council and then respond to questions, if that's okay.
Debbie, thank you. Could you give us, just for people new to the discussion, a quick overview of the ordinance proposal and then talk about your proposed changes?
Sure. So the proposal is for an energy benchmarking and transparency ordinance requiring large commercial buildings to measure their energy use and identify opportunities for saving energy.
Debbie,
And
can I get you to, that microphone isn't, there you go, that's probably going to work better.
Okay. And that's right in line with our joint resolution to reduce greenhouse gases by 80% by 2040. So in this proposed ordinance, we are requiring large commercial buildings over 25,000 square feet to track and measure their energy use using free online systems available through the utilities, reporting that to sharing that data with the city, and then the city, when they do that, they will receive an Energy Star score, and any building getting a score of 50 or above is above average, and so at that point, their obligations are met. But for any building that is below a 50, they would be required to explore opportunities to save energy through a tune-up evaluation. And basically, that evaluation entails looking at their automated systems already in the building to identify what tweaks could be made or very low-cost things that could be done to save energy. So that is the gist of the ordinance. We've gone through a very thorough, I think, stakeholder engagement process that has taken us several years. Started with large stakeholder meetings, facilitated professional facilitation services, and then having smaller group meetings with parties that were concerned about the ordinance and listening to their feedback and incorporating their suggestions and listening to what concerns they had. So like Lehua mentioned, Vicki was here last January with that ordinance, and since then we've continued to get feedback on the proposed ordinance, and just based on our one-on-one meetings with Downtown Alliance and BOMA and others, we're suggesting a few other changes or amendments to our proposal. One of the most significant changes that since the last transmittal I want to highlight is changing the energy tune-up requirement from implementing. We had proposed before requiring an implementation of the tune-up, and now they just have to evaluate the tune-up opportunities, but not necessarily have to implement to reduce the financial burden that might cause on building owners. Realistically speaking, if an owner is going to do the evaluation, it's highly likely that they're going to actually implement it, because the payback on those tune-ups are usually a year or less, and with incentives could be as quick as 3 to 4 months. So some tune-up recommendations might include adjusting thermostats and lighting systems and other automated systems. And we believe the ordinance will make an impact in improving energy efficiency of large commercial buildings, even with this adjustment to the proposed ordinance. Another adjustment that we are recommending is in the transparency requirements. It was discussed quite at length with the stakeholders, and so most stakeholders recognize that transparency is effective in motivating competition and improving Energy Star scores and energy efficiency. So, but instead of publishing all of the buildings' Energy Star scores, we're proposing to just publish the list of buildings by address and owner who receive an Energy Star score above 50. So just publishing a list of the above average buildings, and then they may elect to have their actual score published. And if you have a score of 75 or 80 or above, you're probably going to want that score published because it's a pretty good score. Another adjustment that we're proposing is there was some concern about the violation section. We had referred to the general section in our code, section 1.12. The stakeholders wanted a more defined process, so we're proposing a process where the department issues up to 3 warnings and gives property owners 90 days to come into compliance. And then there are fines up to $500 per violation, but a cap of $1,000 per year. And then a couple of other things I just wanted to bring up. I'm sure that you are still receiving feedback as we are. And there has been another attorney with Curtin and McConkey who has kind of scoured through our ordinance and suggested a few little cleanup adjustments in the ordinance, so I wanted to bring those up with you. The first is a clarification under the scope where we describe what a governed building includes. Item 2 under scope mentions a campus of buildings, and there's been some confusion about what a campus would include or where would that trigger coverage or applicability of the ordinance. So we could consider clarifying language saying that the campuses would be included if the building, at least one building contained over 25,000 square feet of gross floor area. That's been a point of confusion with our own public utilities department as well, and we've talked to them about that. So I think that's probably a good suggestion to incorporate.
Debbie, as a clarification in the way we're interpreting this or could modify it, is a campus considered one unit in regards to measurement, or are we looking at measuring individual buildings within a campus and then accumulating those scores?
I believe that the campus is considered all, typically they're all on 1 meter, and so they would be considered all together. But the ordinance would be triggered if one building was over 25,000 square feet.
Thanks.
The next suggestion had to do with some definitions outlined in section .030, having to do with our governed buildings definition in the gross floor area. The gross floor area is, like I mentioned, what determines the type of areas included in the 25,000 square foot threshold. And it states that anything within exterior walls of a building. However, under the governed building definition, we talk about retail space and say that it includes exterior and interior mall space and shopping centers. And we should probably adjust that definition under retail to only consider the interior spaces of shopping centers and not exterior spaces. And then the last thing is our definition of owner. Under item C, we have included leased properties where the tenant will be occupying the building for a longer than average amount of time. And so specifically, we consider an owner would include a lessee that would be in the building for at least 49 years. There's been some point of confusion in other cities that have adopted this language, and most recently, cities that are adopting similar ordinances are not including this definition under ownership. And we believe the intent of it was to capture buildings where a lessee has a long-term interest in the building. But I think that we can capture that intent in item F, where we state that an owner includes an agent or party duly authorized to act on behalf of the owner. So right now, the attorney's office is evaluating these comments to see what the legal implications are in the ordinance, but if the council wants to include those recommended changes, we can have those changes ready for you.
So, Debbie, I guess the question is, if you're looking at a legal review, Is the administration proposing that we modify the ordinance to include those, or are you looking for our feedback?
Yes, we are, from our initial scan of this, they seem like reasonable requests, and yes, we are proposing that as long as there
No
are no legal
objections.
reasons to not
Okay.
include those.
So, I mean, that's a nuance, but I think rather than straw polling that, unless there are objections from the council for exploring those modifications that it sounds like the administration is supportive of, that we would go ahead and just include those in the final draft.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I would be fine with that, but I guess if we're going to comments, I could throw it all out there right now in regards to this. I received an email from BOMA June 15th, and I would appreciate it if sustainability, I'll forward you the email, if you would be willing to look at it, respond to it, to their questions and concerns.
Yeah,
I'm sure you received that exact same email.
We did, and I believe that Vicky had responded, at least to Stan, on that, and I can forward that response to you.
If that happened in the last week, I have not seen it yet,
Oh,
so
okay.
we might
I
need to
haven't
forward
received
that on.
anything
Let's
either.
forward that on to all
I will-
council
yes,
members.
I will-
That would
I
be
will
helpful.
definitely
Yeah,
forward that on.
I want to see that response before we move forward on this at all. I mean, and when we're talking about the leasee, when you're talking about a triple net lease, you know, when a person owns a building and they do a triple net lease, the person who's renting the building actually takes control of it, and it's their building for the term of the lease.
Right.
How would you enforce that? Would you go to the actual property owner, or would you go to the lessee?
We would go to the lessee, I believe. Kevin Emerson from Utah Clean Energy was very instrumental in helping us draft what that was, and he can get into the nuances of that. I'm not as familiar with triple net leases, but if you want, I can call him
Yeah,
up.
absolutely.
Sure.
Because we all want to learn more about triple net leases.
Stan, I'm not trying to make,
No,
I'm not trying to make light of the situation,
No,
but
I'm
there's a lot of information in here that to me that it's not, we haven't gone through it enough.
I'm not making light
Yeah.
of you.
Okay, well, just because I'm a property owner, I don't think anyone understands how I've been inundated the past week and a half from individuals calling about this. So it's a serious problem.
So my name is Kevin Emerson. I'm the Energy Efficiency Program Director for Utah Clean Energy, and we have grant funding from a variety of sources to help us work on advancing energy efficiency. And so as Debbie said, we've worked in several capacities to try to support research and analysis and model language and ideas, concepts to share with stakeholders and such. To that specific question, the lessee, I think, would be considered the owner for the purposes of enforcement and the responsibility, because it really does all come down to the lessee in that situation. The responsibility to benchmark would be their responsibility.
Did you take that to the attorney's office?
Yes.
How would you enforce that if they don't comply?
We would, well, the enforcement section of the ordinance, we would issue the warning letters, issue fines.
And then what
Very,
if they don't comply? You're not going to take the property from them because they don't own it.
right, continue to accumulate fines is what the ordinance allows for.
Okay. I just, Stan, I think it needs to go back, and I just would feel much more comfortable after hearing from BOMA that they've gone through everything, their questions have been answered, and still, if they could send us an email saying these are still the items that we have issue with.
Well, it sounds like we've got some of those recommendations in our attorney's office currently, so we need to get a response on those. But this might be additional. Okay. Did you have more, Debbie?
No,
Okay.
that was all I
So
had.
let's open it up for question and comments. Aaron, looks like you might have a comment.
Yeah, I usually do. And this one I'm excited about. James, I appreciate your experience, your lifetime of experience as a property owner, and that you bring that to this conversation. I don't believe that we're ever going to come to a resolution on building efficiency indexing and BOMA being on the same page and agreeing, but I do think that the council should probably receive whatever response Vicky put together regarding their point answers those issues as they're raised by BOMA. I think it's
And
worthwhile.
If you wouldn't mind including me, if you're going to meet with BOMA again, please include me in that if you'd be willing to, so I can be there and make sure that all those questions, I just don't feel comfortable that their questions have been properly addressed.
From that email, I'm remembering, I think most of their comments in that email had to do with the emission factors that we were using. The first one, we have adjusted the emission factors. The first point that they brought up, we had adjusted the emission factors to reflect actually what buildings are emitting. And then the second one, they were referring to a national average the EPA publishes on buildings' contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, and the factors that we use are more locally based. That's the gist of what Vicky's response was.
And were the local numbers corroborated with the DAQ, or how did the local numbers come about?
Are you familiar with those emission factors?
You know, I'm not familiar with the specificity of this issue, so I probably shouldn't say anything.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure.
So when
I know that we were looking at DAQ numbers as
let's
well
get a
as-
follow-up on that, just to find
Yeah.
out how we determined our local numbers,
I-
what basis we have for that.
I think my memory of it in the meetings we had was that those numbers were coming through DEQ. So if you could follow up with us, because those numbers are all, of course, vetted by the EPA anyway, so it's even more refined and validated through the same entity. I think ultimately we are probably going to agree to disagree on this issue as a whole. And from an air quality perspective, from a carbon reduction goal achievement perspective, this is the kind of moves we have to make as a city. You guys, our carbon reduction goals. They are so aggressive, and they are completely attainable with these kind of actions. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions around the cost of those assessments, the tune-up assessment that are no longer required but would be, they have to consider. What is the average cost?
So those typically are performed, Rocky Mountain Power will perform a tune-up assessment for no cost. And so it's no cost to the building owner. If they do not qualify for a free assessment from Rocky Mountain Power, they are not required to do the assessment.
Okay. And so then to the incentives that could be anticipated, did you come up with a fiscal idea of what those incentives might be for the different phases of implementation of the proposed plan?
Are you asking about city-financed incentives?
Yeah. Or were there other ideas for funding?
The utility incentives are quite robust and generous, and so we did not, we didn't
We don't need to
identify-
further augment that.
Right, yeah.
So it's free, and then there's already incentives that the city doesn't have to put up, but that could be offered more
Right.
clearly to those
Right,
buildings.
and through, our office, we will be, working very closely with building owners and connecting them and to those resources and helping them become more familiar with what's out there for them.
So who determines hardship? When we look at the updated proposal, the component A around participation in the benchmarking program, the updated proposal says where it would cause a hardship, financial or other special issues.
The ultimate decision maker is the director of sustainability on that hardship. I think it's geared mostly around financial hardship, and if they can demonstrate that.
And is that articulated? Are we defining a standard for hardship?
That is one thing that we've mentioned as a next step is having an ad hoc working group to iron out all the details of how things get implemented, and we are envisioning engaging the stakeholders in that working group to help us decide what those deciding factors are.
I know that our own planning department makes determinations around hardship. regarding zoning issues sometimes. And so can I ask that you reach out to our planning department
Sure.
about those standards and whether or not they're
Yeah.
case by
Sure.
case or if there's a written standard there.
Okay.
And then I know that in the years you've been working on this, that there's several other cities that are farther along in this process that you've used as models to consider our own program here. And I wondered if there was a robust desire that came out of the stakeholder process that was contrary to the programs that we see successful around the country. Was there anything that came out of the big process you went through that was hard to substantiate?
I'm going to defer
Context
to
of others.
Kevin because he was really in the weeds with all of the stakeholder
Kind
engagement.
of putting you on the spot, and you can.
I'll do my best. Probably two things that stand out for me. So this is me, kind of my recollection in terms of participating in a lot of these meetings. The interest in having an incentive that helps from the city that's in addition to the utility incentives that are already available to help possibly those buildings that are already efficient, kind of give them a pat on the back and say, we're going to make it easier for you to get a permit to do some kind of upgrade. And you're energy efficient, so we're going to make it easier for you. Or buildings that are less efficient, maybe provide some kind of incentive for permitting on projects that help those buildings become more efficient. So that was one thing one takeaway that's kind of different than what other cities have done. The other is find a local solution for this transparency concept. So, try not to give my opinion, but just recounting kind of some of the conversations. I know a lot of the conversations from some of the folks who weren't supportive were, let's find a concept that is kind of meets our local needs and is not just cookie cutter, quote unquote. And I think the transparency kind of changes that were made to help provide information to the market without necessarily disclosing all of the energy data that's being proposed is reflective of that.
So that's where we see under B component that instead of requiring all energy ratings and usage information be posted, just the above average performers with an opt-in for their Energy Star score.
Right.
And is the opt-in for all buildings?
Anyone can opt in to have their
Okay.
score published.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I know you have done a lot of work and in collaboration to do a really pretty extensive public process with the stakeholders in our community and come up with a proposal that is unique to Salt Lake City in many ways. So thank you for your work on this.
Thank you, Aaron. Other questions or comments? Andrew.
Thanks again. I like the changes personally about the voluntary nature and using positive reinforcement to promote this instead of trying the negative shaming piece. The question I have is where and how would somebody find this information when it is made public? Where's it going to be housed? How's it going to be shared? Who updates it, et cetera?
It'll probably be housed on SLC Green website, and we would keep that updated.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there anything else in the state that mirrors this at all, or anybody looking at this as well?
In the state, not that I'm aware of, no. No.
Not seriously. I know there are a couple other jurisdictions have expressed interest in the concept, but I don't think there's anything concrete.
Okay. The last piece, it looks like we gave an exemption to nonprofit entities. Sounds like churches and state stuff, basically.
Right.
Do we have a sense of, on a map of Salt Lake City, what that looks like, who can opt out?
As far as percentage of the buildings,
Yeah. Are we going to have donut holes everywhere?
Well,
Tell
we
you
know-
it's significant
Isn't
that
it 42%?
Yeah, it's a large percentage. I'm just
little
wondering.
under 50% for if you look at a property ownership map.
So I'm guessing that we're looking at
But-
there, here, anything west?
yeah. From that, you have to look at the
Schools,
square
too.
footage, though, and how many of the, the largest buildings are nonprofit. And probably the biggest example is the LDS Church, who is
Yeah.
doing a fantastic job at energy efficiency.
So can they opt in then, or is it they have to opt in
Yeah.
voluntarily to do it?
They could, yes.
But this is really geared
Absolutely
towards commercial retail things, right?
Right,
Okay, second hand leases, which comes into James's question about who takes responsibility, right?
right.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions, comments, Derek?
I'd just really like to applaud sustainability and Kevin from Utah Clean Energy. I think that you guys have done a great job with outreach and stakeholder engagement. This has been a really great process from the administrative side, and I think that there have been plenty of opportunities for the private sector to be proactively engaged on this. And I have received an enormous amount of feedback on both the original proposal and this as well. And I appreciate the changes that sustainability has proposed in light of Downtown Alliance and a few other constructive sets of feedback that we've received. And so I think that what we have today is great, and I fully support it. To Aaron's point, we have some ambitious carbon reduction goals in our city, and this is definitely in line with best practices of other cities of our size. Some of the feedback I've received from building owners and operators that have properties both here in Salt Lake, but also in Austin and Seattle and Portland and Denver, other places that are similarly suited as Salt Lake. I think that what we've seen is that progressive, good businesses are interested in participating in this opportunity to receive information and see where their baseline is so that they can make good data-driven decisions. And so I just wanted to thank you for the work that you've done, and I look forward to adopting this as soon as possible.
Thank you, Derek. Any other questions or comments? Debbie, I do have one question. This implementation and monitoring of this program is going to fall to sustainability.
Yes.
Did you do a assessment of time or budget necessary for that?
We have somebody who spends quite a bit of time on the Project Skyline, which is the voluntary program to recognize building owners. And he will be taking this up, and to help ease the burden, I guess, is we're going to make a lot of the information automated so that we can do a lot of online monitoring of reports and requirements. He, as part of that responsibility, also provides workshops and trainings and opportunities for building owners to network and talk about, and learn from each other on energy efficiency. So that will become part of his
So you feel
responsibility.
comfortable that you can absorb this in your current structure?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We are scheduled this evening in our consent agenda to set a public hearing on this issue for, we'll be setting the public hearing next meeting on the 25th for August 8th. Tentative action for August 29th, but we'll have to check for quick either written briefing or a follow-up time for briefing on agenda to get a response to some of the questions we've had raised today. So thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Item number 9 on our agenda is a resolution. It's an interlocal agreement for Parley's Trail through Hillcrest Park. Ben is the council staff member on this, so I'll have Ben introduce this, and we're joined by Chris Jones and Colin Quinn Hurst from Transportation.
The interlocal agreement before the council is to build a segment of Parley's Trail. It's approximately at I-80 and 2000 East. This is at Hillcrest Park, and it would advance the city's urban trails network by connecting Tanner Park with Sugar House Park, and this is part of the larger Parley's Trail, which is envisioned to go from on the east Bonneville Shoreline Trail to the west at the Jordan River Parkway Trail.
A significant portion of that's under construction right now.
Correct.
Along the freeway, if you haven't noticed it.
The interlocal agreement is paired with 2 easements. The first easement is for temporary construction, and it would expire when the construction is finished, and it includes that the county is supposed to restore any improvements to the park that are impacted by the construction, so bring it back to the same level it was before the construction started. The second easement is a perpetual easement, which states that the county will be the sole owner of the trail and will continue to have access to it to provide maintenance and repairs as needed. The outreach the administration did in tandem with the county and with a group called the Parley's Rails, Trails, and Tunnels Coalition. They're a group that's trying to bring the full Parley's Trail project to completion. And there are 2 policy questions for the council. The first one is whether you want to hold a public hearing on this item. It's not required, but you could choose to do so. The other policy question is the time frame in the interlocal agreement is different than the time frame in the perpetual easement. So the interlocal agreement will end in 50 years, and that would require the city and the county to renegotiate who's going to pay to maintain and upkeep the trail, whereas the perpetual easement is in perpetuity. So not sure why there's the 2 different time frames, but I don't know if we'll all be here in 50 years. So that's everything I have.
I'm pretty sure I can guarantee you I will not be here in 50 years. Have we asked for a response from legal about why there might be that discrepancy?
I didn't get a chance to follow up on why, but I did get a clarity that the easement and the interlocal are 2 separate documents.
Okay.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Just comments, since this is in my district. This is really a great project, and I am really excited, and I want to see this go forward. The one question I have is, if we have a public hearing, does that slow down the process?
So there is enough time to hold a public hearing, to set the date, hold the public hearing, and adopt this before construction is expected to start in September. But we would need the decision likely today.
Today, yeah. And I think it would be nice to be able to have that weigh in from the public if we got the time to do it.
Well, before we conclude this discussion today, we'll just draw a poll on that. Before we go to comments and questions, I just wanted to check in with transportation to see if they had anything to add.
I'll speak real quick. Colin Quinn-Hurst is our fantastic urban trails coordinator. He's been working most closely with the county on this project, and he actually prepared the transmittal for this resolution that Katie Lewis helped out with. She's available to answer any questions on the city attorney's office side, and Colin is happy to answer any questions you have on the project management side.
I think there is a little bit of a time issue because they are trying to wrap it up this fall. And so time is of the essence for completing this project, and any delays are costly. So it's something to consider for sure.
Okay. Questions or comments? So Katie, are you prepared to address the issue of the discrepancy in those 2 contractual obligations?
Absolutely. I'm Katie Lewis from the City Attorney's Office. So the Utah Interlocal Cooperation Act has a provision in it that says that interlocal cooperation agreements can only have a term of 50 years. Now, in this case, so that provision is really boilerplate from state law. In this case, I think that you really can separate the obligation to convey an easement, which is what the interlocal agreement does, from the terms of the perpetual easement. In other words, if the city wanted to require maintenance and all of the sort of obligations that go with operating the trail in the perpetual easement, you could certainly do that. And the agreement, the interlocal agreement, would fall away after 50 years, but the perpetual easement with those terms would remain.
Yes, Aaron?
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Okay. So apparently, that sounds like that's something the council might be interested in doing.
Why wouldn't we do that?
Yeah.
Is there a reason we wouldn't do that?
No, that 50-year term really is more, so the act is talking about all sorts of interlocal agreements, and a lot of them are, agreements for joint cooperation between two public entities, which maybe after 50 years you would want to reevaluate. But here, where you're really talking about granting a perpetual easement, certainly the terms that are necessary for the easement can be added in that perpetual document. And Colin just pointed out that the easement actually, as attached to the interlocal agreement, includes language that talks about construction and maintenance. That can be fleshed out further if we'd like to be sure that the county really understands that that is a perpetual obligation.
Okay. It sounds like we might want to do that. So,
Great.
Any other questions or comments? So I want to make sure there are no objections to moving some of that long-term maintenance criteria over to the easement. It sounds like we're okay with that. And then I'd like to straw poll if you have an interest in a public hearing. Thumbs up if you do, thumbs down if you do not. Looks like we're unanimous. We'll schedule that as quickly as possible. We understand time is of the essence. So Ben, if you could check in with the scheduling on that for notification and make sure we do that as quickly as we can.
Mr. Chair, could we, one thing that we could do, depending on the public hearing and the information that we receive, is we could take action that night. We typically don't do that, but on something like this, dependent, of course, it's dependent on the comments we hear back, but I would be surprised if there was a great deal of opposition to this. So that is something that we can.
Yeah, we can take action that night. And also, if it's okay, if it's okay with council members, I would suggest we allow the staff to advertise early if that is timely for getting this in a more aggressive schedule for a public hearing. I don't know that it is, but if it turns out that that could be an advantage for speeding this up, I think it'd be okay if they accelerated that timing before we actually set the date. Is that okay with everybody? All right, sounds good. And Katie, if you will get back to us on that language as quickly as possible for moving it over into the easement.
Absolutely.
I think we're set. All right, thank you all very much.
Thanks.
This is actually really exciting, so thanks. Our next item on our agenda is item number 10. It's an Impact Fees 101. Mike Ackerlow is joining us. Welcome, Mike. Council members, this is just kind of a quick introduction, and a lot of you have this information. Some of you may not. Some of you, this will be review. Some of it will be brand new. But we spent a lot of time last year, in particular when we were looking at our impact fee ordinance, talking about impact fees and what we can and can't do. And we have really a much improved plan and ordinance in place now. But I'll just turn the time over to Mike to run us through this, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions.
Perfect. Thank you. You're right. Some of you are familiar with this information already. It never hurts for a little refresher. This actually came from a community council meeting that the Sugar House Community Council meeting that asked for an overview or a 101 on impact fees. And so this was presented to them, and Council Member Adams was there and thought it would be a good idea to share it with you all. I'll just go through this kind of quickly, and then as the chair said, open it up for some questions. As you may or may not be aware, the impact fees is a state statute. It's governed by 11-36A-101, and then also Salt Lake City Ordinance 18.98. Impact fees is basically a payment from a developer for the impact on new growth that development may create. This would be an impact on our public infrastructure. In the state statute, it says that impact fees can be used for a public facility. A public facility is something that has a life expectancy of 10 years or more and are owned or operated on behalf of a local political subdivision. Our city has 4 primary buckets for impact fees: parks, transportation, police, and fire. Public utilities also collects impact fees separately from this. They have an impact fee facilities plan. But this is not part of the one that I'm discussing, and to be honest with you, I don't know much about their plan or their fees, but we do monitor these 4 fees here in this building. Just a quick overview of where we are. Our previous plan was adopted, as you know, in 2012, end of 2012, and the fees were enacted in January of 2013. The change back then were primarily to the parks and the roadway fees. The roadway fees at that time became citywide rather than just in the Northwest Quadrant and the West Side Industrial area. You may also remember that there was a conflict in the ordinance language, which we brought to you, and the decision was made to reverse that and go back to the way the plan was before and just collect and spend impact fees in the West Side and Northwest Quadrant. However, it was also, the instruction from council was to create a new plan, which we started to do. We hired Fred Philpott, and you're familiar with him and his work. Moratorium was adopted and ran from November of 2015, ended I think the beginning of 2017. However, fees were not collected for 90 days once the plan was adopted. So we started collecting fees on April 24th of this year. I think that covers most everything. The old plan versus the new plan, and again, you're all familiar with this because you adopted this plan, but I think what we have here is a very workable, very doable, clear plan. I felt like our old plan really tied our hands on what we could spend the money on, and it was much more black and white, and this new plan really gives the council and the administration flexibility on how to use those fees. And that's good because we obviously want to spend those within the 6-year time limit. And if we don't have a plan that allows us to do that, that makes it very difficult. One of the things about impact fees is tricky, as you know, is that many projects require a match. And that may be in the form of a bond or general fund or something else like that, and that can be hard to do. So this new plan has shown us how to do that. It's talked about all of our revenue sources, and I believe it makes it much easier to spend those fees. To be able to collect and spend impact fees, the city has to do an impact fee analysis and an impact fee facilities plan. Both of those were completed by Fred Philpott and were adopted by the council. When Fred does the impact fee analysis and impact fee facilities plan, he starts by looking at a service area and demand analysis. So really looking at the city as a whole or certain areas in the city and what those demands are based on new growth. Then identifying a level of service, which really is a performance standard for each of those areas and for their uses of fees. Looking at that, he takes that and then looks at what we currently have and is that meeting the needs of our growth? And if not, what future capital facilities are needed and what the cost of those will be, and then puts together a financing plan to pay for those facilities. As I mentioned, impact fees can only be assessed on new growth, and new growth is determined by the difference between the current level of service and what is projected. Parks, for example, looks at total open space and parks acreage per person, and then is multiplied that by the projected growth. Transportation looks at current and future trips made by mode, and then determines the need for future infrastructure. And police and fire is based on call data, the number of calls per unit, and what that looks like in those certain areas, and then how that would relate to new facilities, new precincts, or fire stations. Here's an example for parks. So the value of parks per capita is $1,637 per person. When we look at the projection estimates for families, Fred's data shows that it's 3.16 per person per household. For a multifamily, 1.88. So then he takes that value of parks per capita, multiplies it by the projection estimate, and comes up with the fee. So down below you see the single family impact fee at $51.73 and the multifamily at $3,078. For some of those, for those of you who are new on the council, there was a discussion when on the old plan about why we just have one lump sum for parks impact fees. It was just a residential impact fee. And there was a discussion of whether a single family has the same impact as a multifamily unit. And so as we talked to Fred, our consultant, he said, no, many cities separate those because the impact can be different. And so that is why we have these different fees. Multifamily, it could be said that, when you have a one-bedroom apartment, obviously the impact on a park would be less than perhaps a single family that may have 4 or 5 bedrooms. This is probably a little well, it's not too blurry. It's kind of blurry on mine, but these are the impact fees that were adopted by the council and the percentage change. And you can see the big ones that went up were in the parks for single family, and that's primarily it. Parks, our old fee was $28.75, and that went up to $51.73.
Mike?
Yeah.
Can you remind us what if you go back one slide, that value of parks per capita dollar amount, how that number was arrived at?
Mm-hmm. He takes the total acreage of open space and parks that we have and divide that by our population.
And then going forward to the next slide, how that value changed? No, back where you were, yeah.
Tell me
Because
where
the proposed at 5,700.
Oh, go up a little bit and you'll see parks at 51.73. I was just using this slide as an example of how parks was calculated. So you can see down here the single family impact fee is 51.73.
Thank
If
you.
you look here, the 57.32 is the total of all fees
Thank you.
for a single family residence. So eligible uses of impact fees. Parks, all open space and park acquisition and development is 100% impact fee eligible. On our old plan, improvements to existing parks had to meet specific uses, and there was a table attached to the plan last time that identified every use and every park and whether it was impact fee eligible. So that went down to fine details like park benches and swing sets and such. And this really gets away from that and says, we can look at all parks and determine whether there's growth there. It's not tied to a specific list. And that's exciting to us because we can use those impact fees faster and more appropriately, and it gets our parks in better condition. You'll see on some, there was a proposal, I believe, on this year's CIP for some improvements to Fairmont Park for some additions there using impact fees. Transportation is probably the one that has, it kind of is a combination of some specific items and then some more general items. So on this screen, you see that new traffic signals, traffic signal upgrades, pedestrian safety devices, bikeways citywide are all eligible for some percentage of impact fees. The Folsom Trail 9 line are more specific, but they're also eligible. Transit amenities at 75%, and the pedestrian overpass at 300 North is 50%. Transportation also has these specific streets that are eligible, and I believe in this year we have Gladiola, we have 5th and 7th, we have 13th East, the Pavement Condition Survey, which are all under, that are asking for impact fees for construction. In terms of the police and fire, the police impact fees will cover a new Sugar House precinct that's 100% eligible. Fire stations 3 and 14, as well as the fire training center and the fire training center large vehicle garage. The training center and the large vehicle garage is currently under construction using some existing bond funds and impact fees. In a recent budget amendment, we did some kind of moving around to free up some of those impact fees so they could go to the fire training center because we had more bond funding than we thought. And so the entire the plan is right now, what we're looking at is the entire fire training center can be covered with impact fees. Fire stations 3 and 14, while they were not covered entirely, much of it was covered. And same with Sugar House Precinct. When we look at that, we've got a little over $3 million in police impact fees that could be used for the purchase of the land and hopefully some construction. The nice thing about this, though, in our new plan is it also allows us ongoing to use impact fees to pay debt service. So while we may not be using 100% of impact fees or impact fees to cover 100% of the precinct because we don't have them now, future collection of those impact fees could be used for that debt service. So we're continually using those fees. I think the great thing, just in conclusion on this, is that with this new plan is it does give us this flexibility. It gives us more options to make sure that we're using these impact fees reasonably, responsibly, and efficiently. So I anticipate that we are hoping we don't have more discussions with the council about having to refund any impact fees.
So Mike, and correct me if I'm wrong, but large fire equipment is also eligible for impact fees based on state statute.
Based on state statute, it is not currently in our impact fees plan, but that could be amended. The rule is, according to state statute, that it has to exceed $500,000 in cost and can only be used, only commercial impact fees can be used to purchase that vehicle.
Okay, thanks. Any questions? Comments? Everybody thoroughly understands everything there is to know about impact fees.
Due to the perfect clarity with which was explained.
I got one question. So based on the formula, the only way to, excuse me, the only way to raise your benchmark for, say, parks in this case, to get a higher kind of number per person, per household kind of thing, is to use non-impact fee money to build new parks, so the next time you reassess impact fees, that
would increase your acreage, and then that would translate it. I mean, all things equal,
yeah,
you'd have to see if your population went up, but still may be the same number. But
I'm just thinking of if the city decided that one of our priorities is more, we want to double our park space. You can't do it through this way, right? Because you're locked in a certain ratio of your population to existing parks. You'd have to up the number of parks, essentially, open space, have the same number of individuals, and then when you reassess, the ratio is completely different, and you can go forward on that. Is that
yeah, I think
accurate?
that's correct. I mean, I haven't ever thought of that before, but I would think that's correct. Right now, fortunately, we can use impact fees to cover that entire cost, but I think to increase that in the future, you'd want to have more parks, which increases your acreage, then would also change your formula.
Okay, thanks.
And so as I recall, if we increase the level of service, that's not impact fee eligible. It's only growth related. So if we set a policy that says we want more acreage per person, we're on the hook for that through general fund.
Right. That would make sense.
Okay. Questions, comments?
A quick update on our balances. We are spending impact fees well, and we're about out. Police has a little over $3 million, but that'll be spent on the police precinct. You committed $500,000 for us to use to do a needs analysis and some preliminary design work. We'll be back to you with some information there and some potential properties. Fire is just under $200,000. Parks is at about 1.8. However, their requests in this CIP exceed that 1.8. So if all is approved, or if most of it's even approved, those fees will be gone. Streets has about 5.7. Streets has I want to say 6 years or something. They have a number of years before any expire. They do use impact fees pretty well. I mean, they are using them and putting them out every year, and I think part of that is a capacity issue on how many streets can they actually build, and so they try to balance what they can actually get done and then request funds that way. Those numbers do not take into account, however, any fees that were collected since the end of April. So that hasn't been reconciled yet. But so I think my guess is those balances are higher, but don't have those exact numbers yet.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time. We're a little ahead of schedule, but I do see Cindy Cromer in the audience. So item 11 on our agenda is a board appointment interview for Metro Water Board. Cindy Cromer. Cindy, could you come up front and find a comfortable seat? And I'll have you give a little introduction of yourself, although that's probably not necessary, and tell us a little bit about your interest in this particular board.
Well, I'm interested in it because Stan asked me to consider applying, and then Aaron and Lisa interviewed me, and they didn't seem to have any objections, and I counted 3 votes. And that's better than I usually do with land use issues. And so I thought I'd give it a shot and try to get to 4. I have been working on water conservation since I was a graduate student and realized I didn't have enough time to do my graduate studies and water my landscapes a whole lot. So I started switching to drought-tolerant plants. And I've been on water issues pretty much since then with the first Canyons Master Plan and the rate study that was done in 2002, 2003, and relentless efforts to encourage my landscapes and my rental properties to use less water. I've torn out a lot of turf in my time. And this board is a stellar board with impressive members. I hope that you don't replace some of them before I get my feet on the ground, because there are really some incredible mentors there. I hope Tom Godfrey in particular will stay a little while longer and show me the ropes, and Pat Comerell will be there for a while longer. I'm sorry that Dave Bueller has rotated off, and Joan DiGiorgio, who you're set to appoint tonight, is just an absolute heroine in my world. So it's a good fit for me, and especially because I don't see any conflicts with the things that I already do. So you're not getting rid of me by appointing me to this board, because I will still show up on all the land use issues and still say pretty much the same thing that I've been saying for decades. So
I can, I think, safely assure you it was not our intent to keep you busy with something else, so that we wouldn't have to see you. That was certainly not our intent. Thank you, Cindy. Any questions, comments? James?
I just have a comment, and that's that we don't see often somebody that is so involved with the city like you, Cindy, come and are willing to be on a board like this and still continue to do what you're doing, and it's just very appreciative that you're so involved.
Well, thank you, but it's an addiction. If I could stop, I would.
Are you seeking help for that?
Yes.
Any other questions or comments?
Thanks very much.
Cindy, thank you very much. We'll have you on our consent agenda for this evening. You do not need to be present to win, and but you probably will be. Yeah, that's true. I just want to share on behalf of the board how much we appreciate the time and commitment you've made to Salt Lake City. Thank you very much. And it looks like the timing's perfect. Someone's been watching us online. Again, we are a little ahead of schedule, but that's your cue to come up.
I didn't mean to make such a big entrance. I was hoping to duck in a little bit. So.
Yeah, I think we know better. Item number 12 on our agenda is an advice and consent interview for a redevelopment agency chief operating officer. The appointment is Danny Waltz. Just for clarification, this is an RDA appointment. However, advice and consent is the responsibility of the city council. That's why you're seeing it on the city council agenda. This is something we explored extensively. So pretend you're also wearing your RDA hats in this process. Welcome, Danny. Could you give us a quick introduction of yourself and your experience and your interest in this position?
Sure. First off, thank you very much for having me tonight, I guess. It's been a while since I've been in this room. Let me start by thanking the mayor as well for this appointment and putting the nomination before you. And thanking Laura Fritz for her persistence, I guess is probably the best word I can use, for how I'm here tonight. And thank you to each of you that I was able to meet with and taking the time out of your schedule. I appreciated the opportunity to sit down and hear from each of you on your thoughts and views on redevelopment. As far as myself, I feel very fortunate to be here tonight, that over the length of my career I've had the opportunities presented before me that have given me the experience to be considered for this position. As you probably know, looking at my resume, I started here with Salt Lake City at the redevelopment agency as an intern. At that time, I came in and I had no idea what a redevelopment agency did or how it worked, and yet I was charged with immediately going through all of the agency's documents and legal contracts to discern what was in them that we had to require of ourselves and developers. And for whatever odd reason, I enjoyed that, and I wanted to continue with that. And the management of the RDA at the time decided to keep me on. And in doing so, I managed over 9 years, thank you, managed over 9 years to work my way up the career ladder from research analyst to project coordinator to project manager to senior project manager. I was fortunate in those 9 years to work on projects that ranged from everything from small business renovation loans to large projects like the Marriott Hotel at the Gallivan Center, doing projects like creating Hidden Hollow and Sugar House, creating the West Capitol Hill project area, proceeding to do over $5 million in property acquisition. That is property that is still being developed today. Overseeing the Gallivan Center maintenance and programming, as well as reimbursement agreements such as the Commons at Sugar House. And so I had a wide range of projects and experience that I was ultimately able to take with me to Midvale City to become their redevelopment director, where I've been for the past almost 13 years. And in my time at Midvale, I've overseen the redevelopment of 2 Superfund project areas, one which has been extremely successful and touted by the EPA as the poster child for how to do everything right for a Superfund project area, and the other that is probably the poster child for everything that can go wrong with the Superfund project area. But the successful one has been great in terms of we have taken the base year total property tax value of that from $4 million in 2004 to well over $400 million right now. And in doing so, we have redeveloped almost 400 acres with housing, commercial, parks, open space, all around a transit hub. I've been fortunate to work on projects such as the national headquarters for FL Schmidt, Overstock.com, CHG. We've built parks in that area. We've overseen reimbursement for projects such as Topgolf, all of this on top of a Superfund site and overseeing the reimbursement to developers for those costs. One of the projects I'll be wrapping up in my final weeks there, should this be successful, is the other Superfund site, which we have been spending the past 2 years trying to work through with developers and consultants and the EPA and attorneys to get that project finally up and rolling. And so I've been extremely lucky in terms of my career to have the ability to work on a lot of projects, a broad range. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily an expert in any particular area as much as kind of a jack of all trades, and able to hopefully bring that experience now to this agency and Salt Lake City. I look forward to overseeing the department, working with the staff, and I suspect that they will probably teach me a lot more than I will be able to teach them. But I think it's a great opportunity, and I'm excited to come back to Salt Lake City and work on this agency and get it back to working on great projects and becoming that preeminent agency of the state.
Thank you, Danny.
And thanks for letting me ramble.
Not rambling at all. Exactly what we needed.
Thank you.
I'll take some time now from council members, see if we have any questions or comments. Lisa, I know you will, but I'm going to start over here first. So
that seemed like that was the go-to
question
direction
or
right off the
comments.
bat.
Derek?
Hi, Danny. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, sir.
And congratulations for your nomination.
Thank you.
I have been serving as the vice chair of the redevelopment agency over the last 2 years, almost 2 years. And I'm sure that, from the folks that you know from within, as well as just reading the newspaper and being engaged in RDAs in the state, you know that our city's redevelopment agency has undergone enormous change in the last 18 months.
Yes.
A lot of it has been for the better, but it has not been without its own set of struggles and frustrations. But I do feel like we're in a better spot now, and we have a lot of opportunity in front of us as an agency and as a city. And so, as an incoming RDA director and somebody who is tasked with leading, some employees that have been around for a long time and an organization that has a very rich history of some successes, what is your vision for the RDA going forward? It's been recently folded into the Department of Economic Development, and so it obviously will play a role in furthering goals beyond just redevelopment. And so can you talk to me about what you imagine for the Redevelopment Agency of Salt Lake for
Sure.
the next 5-10 years?
Sure. I would start by simply saying that my goal, first and foremost, is to develop that plan and that vision with the council, with the mayor and the staff, as far as what I see as the agency needing in terms of that direction is essentially going back to focusing on what redevelopment agencies are about, which is first and foremost building the property tax value of the city and the areas that we work within. And in doing so, you have to look at focusing on multiple areas. First and foremost is the economic development side of things. And so to your point in terms of bringing the RDA under economic development, I think that's been a very good change. I think that really puts the priority on the number one thing that the agencies should be doing. That is the biggest bang for your buck that you get. The second thing are building upon what you as a council have done in terms of setting aside money for affordable housing and making sure that we have a clear vision and plan for how we want to use those funds. And again, making sure that we're hitting as many of the goals that we want in the use of those funds. And then third, the overall goal for agencies is looking at things that may not necessarily be as glamorous, may not necessarily give you as big of a return on your dollar, but those are the infrastructure and the placemaking things that I believe RDAs need to have a role in, either within the other projects that we do or going out and seeking those projects that may not be being accomplished by the city or developers right now, and what we can be. And so I think as far as the vision and the leadership for the agency is finding the balance between hitting all of those goals while at the same time establishing a vision that can last beyond just whether it's my position or the council or the terms of the elected officials, but something that you can look at that will withstand 5, 10, 15 years.
And you've just had an opportunity to bite around the edges a little bit with your conversations with staff and all of the board members. But at first glance, what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities and barriers to the agency going forward? Do you have anything that stands out?
I think the biggest opportunities are the 3 project areas you're looking at in terms of State Street, 9 Line, and the Northwest Quadrant. I think the Northwest Quadrant is a huge opportunity, but it's doing development in a way that, for obvious reasons, is difficult to do on its own market conditions. And so you're looking at infrastructure costs and site conditions costs out there that are very similar to what we've had to do in Midvale and Superfund sites, but you're dealing with them on a basis in terms of property that you're not entirely sure exactly what is out there. So that's an enormous opportunity for economic development. I think the State Street and 9 Line project areas are great opportunities for doing development, not just in the core of the city and having that extend out from State Street, but also on 9 Line with the west side and trying to get that shot in the arm for those areas of the city. The issues with each of those, I can't speak to the Northwest Quadrant one because I haven't been as involved in looking at that one. But as far as the 9 Line and the State Street one, your biggest issues are that you have areas that the market has ignored or passed over for the past 20 plus years. And how do you really find the right mix of what we should be doing in those areas? And first and foremost, we have to really look at where we're at with that project area plan, what our goals and objectives are, and what our plan is in terms of an action steps of how we're going to accomplish that. And in looking at those project areas, I think one of the biggest issues we have is just how to grow that increment significantly enough that you're going to have money to do that. And in doing that, what are we specifically going to want to do? On the 9 Line, you have an enormous amount of residential development within that project area. And while it's very ambitious in trying to get that area to turn around, housing in and of itself doesn't necessarily generate a lot of tax increment that you can then turn around and put back in the project area. So what can we do, or how do we spend those dollars in a way to get that biggest bang for your buck? With State Street, your biggest advantage is that you are along State Street, and that should be an extremely successful commercial corridor throughout the city. But you have issues with that in terms of the current uses and the proposed uses that are going to be in State Street, and you're going to have to work in terms of how to mitigate that and build positive development around that in order to offset those negative impacts. So what does that look like? Is that strictly commercial? Is that residential? How are we going to address that? I can't tell you I have all those answers today because I haven't necessarily been able to dive into the details, but I think those are the opportunities you have, and if you can pull those off, you would have 2 areas of the city that are crucial to redeveloping it as a whole, and not just rejuvenate the west side, but also have that identity on State Street that you'll be proud of people driving down State Street as a way to come into the city.
I appreciate your thoughts on that, and I also wanted to thank you for your time about a week and a half ago, sitting down with Lisa and I. It was really great to get to know you, and assuming everything goes well, I look forward to working with you.
I do too. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Charlie?
I don't really have any questions. I unfortunately did not have a chance to sit down with Danny, but I look forward to working with you in the future. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Lisa?
Danny, thanks so much for being here, and I would point out that he does reside in District 7, so you know he's quality. What can I say? It's my job to always have questions, so there you go. I just couldn't do it without. As has been mentioned a little bit by Derek, over the past 18 months, we've been going through some growing pains as we've gone from the previous model to a separation of powers model. I know you've come from a different model of government in Midvale. You worked here before when it wasn't separation of powers. What is your understanding of separation of powers?
Philosophically, or as it relates to RDA?
Both.
I think government operates best when you have that separation of powers and you have the clear roles of what each branch of the government is to do. And then the key is to work within those defined roles is having the communication that you can go back and forth to what each department or each arm of the government is trying to accomplish. And so my understanding is we've structured the RDA now, and the way it should be is that you are overseeing the board, the budget and the policy through the board, and the mayor is overseeing the administrative functions. So as it works within those, the job of my position and Laura and those of us on staff is to basically work between the policy and the direction that you, the board, give through the budget and the policies that you set in place, and oversee that and coordinate and communicate that with the mayor's office in terms of what their vision is of how they would like to see that carried out. And the hard part is trying to find the balance in that. And that's the unenviable position that we will be in. But if we do it right, then our goal is to sit there and try to make sure that everyone gets a win out of it and that you're not fighting.
Main thing we want is the city to get a win out of it. That's
Say
the
that
goal.
again?
The main thing we want is for the city to have a win.
That's where we're at.
And that is the goal. You somewhat answered my second question, which is you work for the mayor, but you have a responsibility to the board. When you were here before, pretty much everyone in the RDA was responsible to 8 people.
Yes.
And 8 bosses is a lot of bosses. Now, it's not quite like that. But nevertheless, you work with the board to help us as we develop policy. What do you see your role specifically? You were saying as a kind of a bridge. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. I see my biggest priority in my role is to provide not only the council, but the mayor also with the information that you need to make the right decisions. You are the policymakers. The mayor guides the administrative functions of the city. For all intents and purposes, you said we have 8 bosses, so we have 8 people to tell us what to do. The issue with the different branches and the roles of those is essentially that you are limited or you're guided by what your responsibilities are in terms of what you can tell us to do. So my role is to give you the information so that you can make those decisions and give us the policy and the direction that you want to lay out for the city. You may not always want to hear it. You may not always like the information we give you, but our role is to give you that information so you can make it. And if we're not giving you all of the information and all of the options, then we're not doing our job.
And that would be something that I think is really important. One frustration I know we have had is we've asked for information, and often it's dribbled out. We get a little piece at a time, and it's a crumb here and a crumb there. And we've been working to have it be the whole cake, not just the crumbs. And I think we're moving towards that. So I hope you can help us in doing that. I'm also interested in knowing, when you've been in a suburban area as a redevelopment director, what do you see your role in an urban development area as RDA?
That's a good question. I've never really thought of my job in terms of suburban and urban. I think the easy answer to that is Salt Lake City should be the premier destination. You know, and as my job in Midvale, we realized we weren't Salt Lake City and we weren't going to be able to have a lot of the uses that you should have in Utah. We weren't going to get the Broadway Theater. Sorry, Sandy. That should be in the heart of Utah. That should be in Salt Lake City. And so I think you're looking at that in terms of how do you balance that with what are the types of uses that we as Salt Lake City should have in our capital city? What are those uses and businesses that we should be targeting? And what are we not doing right now, and why aren't we getting those? As I've said to Laura, I've spent the better part of the last 12 plus years in the suburban market trying to figure out what we can take away from the larger markets in order to succeed.
So how are you going to help us protect Matt Dahl from taking stuff away from it?
Well, I didn't want it to get personal and start naming names, but I'm going to tell you what we did in terms of luring those businesses away from you. I'm going to tell you why we need to look at things like freeway access and fiber. I'm going to tell you why we need to look at what we have to do in terms of incentives and what that balance is with what our return can be versus what is unreasonable. We don't want to unduly enrich developers or businesses. But there are cities out there that are doing that. And so we have to find that balance and make sure that we're prioritizing those uses that we feel are really important and need to be in Salt Lake City, and what are the ones that we're not necessarily as worried about investing in, and if they leave, then they leave. And so, but we have to look at those bigger picture issues. It's all of the things that Laura is going to come to you in terms of her economic development plan, of what can we do as a city? What are we not doing in terms of everything from, what's the building permit process? What is our business retention? What are the fields of industry that we should go out and start targeting to come to Salt Lake City? How do we address those within areas like the Northwest Quadrant? And how do we address those in areas like downtown, where maybe the issue is just how much space is available? If we don't have the amount of office space available to get these businesses, then what can we do to start going out and build that? And whether that's office or retail or industrial, those are things that we can start tying into an overall plan with the redevelopment agency and identify those target areas of where we can help the city accomplish those goals.
And my last
Affordable housing, but you have to have that blend. You have to provide housing at all levels, and that's everything from the transitional housing out of the homeless shelter to the high-end market housing. And as part of the agency, you have to identify what housing works within what areas and do what you can to make that happen. Housing is more of something where if someone wants to live in the city and the city is doing what they need to be, the housing developers will come. And so what can the agency do in areas where the housing isn't necessarily coming? How do we break down those barriers, encourage those developers to come there? But housing is a critical part of anything that an agency does. I mean, that at the very root and the historic core of redevelopment agencies, that's what we were meant to do, is to go in and cure that urban blight and make it to where people were no longer leaving the cities for the suburbs, but having a reason to come back and live within that urban core. And then as part of that urban core, you also have to look at the outlying areas like Sugar House or the West Side, and how do we make it to where those are attractive for people who want to still live close to the city and have those services but still feel like they're out in the neighborhoods and have that piece of property that they want.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Aaron?
Hi, Danny. Welcome.
Thanks, Sarah.
To go back to State Street, that's a project area that's already near and dear to me, and it has long ingrained issues that definitely continue south of Salt Lake City's borders along State Street into Midvale and other cities. But you talked about how important the plan is for that area and making sure that we get the right plan and steps in place. How do you know? How do you know when you struck that right balance in the plan that it is actually going to succeed at turning decades and decades of blight?
I don't think you know when you draft it. I think your goal when you draft that plan is you do exactly what you just said. You put down what you think is the necessary vision. You identify what the issues are in that area that you're trying to solve, and you start proposing ways in which you feel you can address those issues. But you have to understand, when you set up a project area plan, you're trying to look 25 years into the future, and the market today is going to be very different than what the market is going to be in 5, 10, or 15 years. And so within that plan, as you identify the issues you're trying to address and what you feel are the best ways to do it, you also have to build into it the flexibility that if and how the market changes, you can change with it.
Sure, but how do you, I guess let me get more specific, how do you sufficiently represent the community's vision? I'm talking the residential community and the existing businesses' vision and needs with while allowing the area to grow beyond and do so appropriately. I mean, because I can see where in a blighted area there are businesses that will go with redevelopment and there's businesses that will stay, and it's not so easy for us to draw a line on a map and say we're going to do outreach to these and not to the others, and we'd never want to do that.
No, and you're right, and what I was trying to say is in your plan you identify those issues and you identify how you want to address them today. And that way you're incorporating everything that the community wants. You're incorporating what they are telling you they need or what they feel that is important to them. And you outline your plan in ways of here are the action steps of exactly what we're going to do to address those. And on top of that, what I was simply saying is you just have to have the flexibility that if something happens on its own and is not necessarily needed to be targeted by the RDA, then what else can the RDA do to adjust to market conditions? And so if your issues today are crime or the housing or the commercial or vacancy. There are things you can outline in that plan right now that you can address, whether that's, better building design or increased police force or going in and targeting some of these areas or working with the developers and the business owners that are there to improve their property. Those can be very specifics that you put in the plan, but just looking at it over a 20 or 25-year period, you also have to build in that ability that you're not.
State and North Temple are particularly ingrained, not just from a transportation perspective, but the culture that exists there, the business mix that exists there. And gosh, I think we have a lot to learn from other cities who have attempted similar redevelopment areas. So I hope that you'll be working with your staff and bringing to us a travel itinerary and some ideas for exploring outside of the city. So the last part, I thought that was a really good question, Lisa, around the difference between suburban and urban, and you made a really pointed comment in our interview discussion about the reputation of Salt Lake City today. And I'm not going to ask you to get into that right now, but I will later. But I think that therein lies the complexity that is the difference between the capital city and other cities in this state. And that is that we have some very aggressive and high priorities. We have a mayor who ran on eliminating homelessness. We have 2 new homeless resource centers that we're about to build and construct with partners. We have a prison coming. We have downtown issues that other cities deal with at piecemeal at best.
Yes.
And therefore, we have a lot invested in those games. Also, we have aggressive energy policies, environmental initiatives, and it becomes, I think it's a very passionate palette that you have. And not to say that other city councils and mayors aren't passionate, they surely are. We have a very passionate group here, and that those growing pains that Lisa talked about, I think we look to your position actually to help guide us through this awkward puberty and into a really healthy maturity. That is the desire of this body. Can I speak on behalf of all of us and just say we all want the best for the city? And our passions have come into play, but the reality is you are biting off a bigger job than any other city in this state could give you in terms of RDA work. And we have a lot we're bringing to this game. Addressing sex trafficking, human trafficking on State Street, and the probability of displacement of populations that don't necessarily need to be displaced is a little piece of what I'm going to bring to this conversation. And it does make it more complicated, but I welcome you. I think that what you're bringing is something we uniquely need, and that you're in a position to bring us into maturity as hopefully we're finishing this transition we're in.
Thank you.
So welcome, Danny.
And I will say that as Salt Lake City, we need to strive to be the best. We need to strive to be that capital city and that example for everyone within the state. And as far as the RDA is concerned, I will tell you that you have an entire staff that is welcoming to that challenge. They are eager to take that on and do that work. And we hope to put that in place for you and get that structure ready so that we can start addressing those issues and bring those projects to you. And there's a saying that you hear, and we say it a lot, that if it was easy, then we wouldn't need to be doing it. If it was easy, it would be out being done on its own. But we're here to do the hard work. We're here to do what is, for whatever reason, not being done. And in doing so, if we can involve the other issues that need to be addressed and that the city is striving to accomplish, then that is what we'll try to do.
Great.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm conflicted about that comment that's made me reflect on my own puberty. So that was a painful experience for me. So, but I appreciate the analogy, James.
Can you make your voice crack while you say that?
I feel like mine is up here right now, cracking. So,
James.
Danny and I had a great conversation yesterday for the full hour, so I think he's answered all my questions. I'm eager for him to get started and be able to he's already got his feet wet, but actually get fully immersed in what's going on in the RDA, so I appreciate it.
Thank you, Danny. And Patrick, I'm totally sorry. I forgot or didn't mention, I forgot to acknowledge you. So Patrick Leary, thank you for joining us here. Danny, thank you for your time this evening. You are actually scheduled on our consent agenda for later tonight in our formal meeting. I expect that will go well. And we appreciate the time and commitment you've made to serving Salt Lake City. So thank you very much. We look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Thanks. The last item on our agenda is reports and announcements from the executive director, Cindy.
Okay. Just a simple item. There are times when we have collisions, so to speak, between state statutes and city ordinances. One is changed and the other needs to be updated to match it. And that is the case that was brought to staff's attention today by council members Mendenhall and Penfold. And this relates to the state liquor law changes. There needs to be a change in city ordinance to make the language match. So we just found out about this today, and what we wanted to do is just quickly ask for your permission to look at it further and identify what the quickest route is to get it resolved.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Charlie.
Just a quick comment. So this was also brought to my attention from the same individuals that contacted council members Mendenhall and Penfold. They operate the Trestle Tavern on 15th and 15th. It is a great new business. It's been around for about a year. Has worked very, very well with the neighborhood. It's something that I think is a great example of how an establishment like this can and should work in the community. So whatever help we can give them would be supported by me.
So at this point, council members, the staff would like some time to look at the state language and how they might best accelerate a modification to city code that would accommodate these needs so that we don't find ourselves in situations where companies are caught in the middle of a translation between state code and city code. If you're okay with that, the staff will come back to us with a recommendation.
And it may be that the fastest route is a temporary zoning amendment, and if so, we can get that prepared for your next meeting. We wanted to be certain and check with planning and that kind of a thing. So.
Any questions? There's no report from the chair and vice chair, and we do not have a closed session this evening. So that concludes our briefing meeting this afternoon.
I do just want to say that for the formal meeting tonight, I would really like to set the record for the fastest formal meeting. So any help would be appreciated.
I don't know that we have that current record information. I know that there's a short one. I want to say 7 minutes, but I'm not.
Carlton holds it.
I think Carlton does hold it. It's surprisingly short.
We'll see.
But we'll see how that goes. We'll reconvene across the hall at 7 o'clock. Charlie Luke will be conducting the meeting this evening, and he's already given your instructions. Dinner is available over here in the office on the liaisons table. Thank you all very much.
And Mitch McConnell has killed the filibuster, so we don't need to worry about that.
Poonam with SLC TV. Thanks for watching Capital City News, your connection to Salt Lake City government. I'm at the scenic Miller Park today, enjoying the lush green trees and shaded pathways. Now, trees offer many benefits to Salt Lake City, from clean air to food production and even economic opportunities. For this week's episode of Capital City News, we'll hear from Tony Glayot, our urban forester, and our History Minute this week is about Calvin L. Rampton. Let's get started with our look back.
Kids out there, keep doing good things. Look for our officers. We have a lot of these coupons that we'll be handing out.
I wanted to acknowledge the importance of arts and what it does for us in our economy and what it does for us in this community.
Communities that support the arts and culture are investing in industries that support jobs, that generates government revenue, and is the cornerstone of tourism.
And whereas the Utah Arts Festival is the largest outdoor multidisciplinary arts event in Utah, attracting nearly 80,000 attendees from across the state, nation, and globe. Now therefore, I, Jacqueline M. Biskupski, Mayor of Salt Lake City, do hereby proclaim June 22nd through June 25th, 2017 as Arts Days in Salt Lake City.
The city maintains over 8,500 public property trees and plants over 800 neighborhood trees each year. The city's urban forester, Tony Glayot, has more.
I would say the first time I really started to have an appreciation for an interest in trees was at a very young age. I lived in a neighborhood in Illinois that was filled with oak trees and hickory trees, and we had a very large, probably 200-year-old oak tree in the front of our property. And I would play around the tree all the time, never thought anything of it as a 4, 5, 6-year-old kid. But then one day, probably when I was 7 or 8 years old, the tree was struck by lightning and essentially destroyed, and it had to be removed. And I remember thinking when that happened, even at 7 or 8 years old, what a loss that was to my life. It was the first time I probably looked at trees as something more than just a place to play. When I first was about to go to college, I didn't know necessarily what I wanted to do. I just knew that I didn't want to be in an office all the time, and I knew that I had a love of the outdoors and of nature. And I originally got into natural resource management, and then thankfully I had this wonderful college counselor who said, you should look into urban forestry and the care of trees for cities and urban spaces. And I had never heard of such a thing. I didn't realize that people actually could make a career out of that. But it sounded just like the perfect job for me. And I gravitated my career towards urban forestry and large-scale forest management at that point, and the rest is history. When you think of urban forestry, Mr. T probably isn't the first thing that comes to your mind. It's an interesting story because it's interesting to think that an inner city kid from that grew up in the projects of Chicago could have such a lasting and important impact on the way that cities and communities appreciate and seek to preserve trees. But Mr. T did just that inadvertently. He, in 1987, so 30 years ago this year, Mr. T was at the height of his career. He was a movie star and a TV star and kind of the pinnacle of his celebrity. So much so that he was able to purchase a beautiful mansion in one of the most affluent communities or neighborhoods north of Chicago. And he wasn't there very long before he realized that he didn't really like the forested character of his multi-acre estate, and he proceeded to cut down more than 100 mature trees. Many of them were oak trees that had been there more than 150 years. And it was that event that kind of galvanized the whole community and really the area to say, we need to do something to prevent this kind of tragedy from happening. Trees are that important to our city. And the city quickly drafted and adopted a tree protection ordinance, one of the strictest and first of its kind. And it's funny, it sounds like a little bit of a local story with local implications, but cities across the nation followed suit rather quickly, and now, today, 30 years later, urban forestry programs and tree protection ordinances are commonplace in municipalities that value the benefits that trees provide. Residents wishing to enlist the helpful services of the urban forestry program, whether that's planting a new tree or caring for an existing tree, can give us a call or visit our website. We'll be happy to help you out.
And now it's time for a History Minute.
Calvin Rampton was born in 1913, studied law at the University of Utah, and worked as an attorney while he began to run for offices in the state. He lost 6 elections in a row until he was elected to become the 11th governor of Utah in 1964. He served for 3 terms as a Democratic governor. He's the only governor in Utah's history to have served 3 complete terms. As governor, he was known for modernizing state government, developing the model to develop tourism and economic prosperity in the state, expanding the size of the state's universities, and for his unflagging honesty. Once, when asked about Jimmy Carter while he was running for president, Rampton said that Carter was one of the worst governors he'd ever worked with. Jimmy Carter heard this and called up Governor Rampton and asked if he really said that, to which Rampton replied, "Yes, Jimmy, I really did, but I didn't know there were reporters there." He was one of the most popular governors to hold office in Utah, and his legacy is still felt in the state. Today, Salt Lakers are reminded of him daily as the Salt Palace bears his name in memoriam. He passed away in 2007 at the age of 94.
That's it for another episode of Capital City News. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe this fireworks season. It's going to be hot and dry out, so be careful. Enjoy your time with family and friends. And please check out SLC Gov on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram because there are a ton of free events happening throughout the city. Signing off from Miller Park, I'm Poonam Kumar. With SLC TV. Thanks for watching Capital City News. Salt Lake City has a very active and energetic art scene. In fact, there are over 200 pieces of public art displayed around the city, including the Galvin Center's Water Walk. The city's urban areas showcase various works from both experienced and emerging local artists. We hope you get a chance to experience local art while out and about in the community this summer. For this week's episode, we'll hear from Leah Summers about the city's arts and culture scene. And our History Minute is about the Salt Lake City Warm Springs. Let's start off with our legislative update and look back.
Had the official opening for the University to Downtown Bikeway, which is a simple paint-only bikeway connecting between the University of Utah and downtown. It provides 3 different routes, working their way through the neighborhoods using mostly quiet neighborhood streets, but connecting the 300 South protected bike lanes downtown to the University of Utah campus. Well, it's nice to finally have a route that connects the whole way. We've had the 300 South bike lanes and we've had the 200 South bike lanes. Well, eventually the vision is to connect to the intermodal hub. For more information, including a route map, you can go to bikeslc.com.
I want to welcome you all to the future site of Salt Lake City Fire Station number 3. We need a station here in the Sugar House area. It's booming, and we need the resources. We need the ability to react and be responsive to our community, and this is the facility that's going to enable us to do that.
This building will be a net zero building, the 3rd fire station in the country to be built that way.
The station will utilize solar features, specialized insulation, natural light.
I do know that it's going to produce as much energy as we're going to use out of it, and I'm excited about that.
For over 25 years, the Downtown Farmers Market has been a leader in sustainable efforts, not only to grow a local food culture and economy, but also in its efforts to develop a sustainable future for our communities. Some of those efforts have been leading the way at recyclables and compostables that they've led here. It's also a great way to educate people about the sustainable initiatives of the city and the county as a whole.
For this week's interview, we'll hear from Leah Summers, Salt Lake City Mayor's Senior Advisor for Arts and Culture.
My name is Leah Summers. I'm Mayor Biskupski's Senior Advisor for Arts and Culture. The mayor contacted me because her vision for arts and culture in the city is to make Salt Lake City an arts and culture destination. We already have all of the great arts and culture we need to be a destination. It's just the world doesn't know it. So somebody with a strong passion for the arts as well as a background in marketing was what she was looking for, and I miraculously fit the bill. So a recent study from the National Endowment for the Arts told us that Utahns have the highest rate of attending performances per capita than any other state in the entire nation by a huge margin, like 20%. So we have a huge amount of arts and culture in the city and also throughout the state. To have the density of all of the arts locations in one small area with a relatively small population is really unique to Salt Lake City. There's a lot of data that supports the idea that arts promote economic development. We're standing in front of the Eccles Theater. One example of that is it's a chain reaction. Every time people decide to leave their houses and come to a performance here at the Eccles Theater, they're not only buying a ticket, which fuels the economy, they're coming down to Salt Lake City, they're parking their cars in a parking structure, they're maybe having dinner with their family, maybe going out afterward for a little bit of dessert, and then coming back maybe for another time if they enjoyed their experience. So times that by the 2,000 people sitting in the theater, that's a big impact for a downtown. Some of the things that we're working on as a city to help bolster that is in 2010, the city and the county formed a partnership to invest sales tax revenue back into specifically supporting arts and culture in the downtown area, which is the highest concentration of arts organizations in the city. The way that it will work is these funds that are set aside from sales tax increment go back into specifically promoting the arts and culture that we already have and adding vibrancy to the city through creative placemaking. So all of those things are aimed at helping the programs and institutions that we already have existing as a background support infrastructure. So we spent most of last year coming up with a master plan for strategies on how should we look to expend those funds during the life of this partnership, which started in 2010 and is set to last for 20 years, and got some really great, robust community feedback that has influenced what we have in the plan. So for information specific to the Cultural Core, we have a website, slcgov.com/cultural core. So if they wanted to read the plan, get an understanding for what may be coming down the pipeline, I would always encourage that, because while we do have a strategy lined out in the plan, it can always be changed and adapted for what the community tells us we need more.
And now we take a trip back in time for our History Minute on the Warm Springs Plunge.
Long before the Mormon pioneers arrived in the valley, the warm springs on the north end of Salt Lake were in use by the Shoshone, Utes, and Paiutes. When the pioneers arrived, though, they quickly developed bathing facilities over them and used the warm springs as a social gathering spot. In 1850, an adobe building was built over the springs to create an indoor spot for women to bathe and an outdoor swimming spot for men. The building was also a social hall dedicated by Brigham Young as the first spot for dancing in the new city. In 1921, Salt Lake City took over the management of the Warm Springs and gave it the name the Warm Springs Municipal Bath. They built a new building over the spot and piped in water from the nearby springs for the pools to be used inside. In 1932, they changed the name to the Warm Springs Plunge to attract more visitors. The Warm Springs Plunge remained popular until the mid-1970s, when the facility couldn't attract enough of a crowd to stay open. The building closed and the pools were drained. By 1983, the building would reopen as the Children's Museum of Utah. In the early 2000s, the Children's Museum closed and relocated to the Gateway. Since then, the building stands vacant in the middle of Warm Springs Park, waiting for restoration.
That's it for another episode of Capital City News, your connection to Salt Lake City government. This summer, when you're out and about, be sure to check out the local artwork, including the International Peace Gardens, where you can enjoy art from around the globe. Thanks for joining us, and please tune in next time. For SLC TV, I'm Poonam Kumar. Hi, I'm Poonam with SLC TV. Thanks for watching Capital City News, your connection to Salt Lake City government. I'm at the scenic Miller Park today, enjoying the lush green trees and shaded pathways. Now, trees offer many benefits to Salt Lake City, from clean air to food production and even economic opportunities. For this week's episode of Capital City News, we'll hear from Tony Goliot, our urban forester, and our History Minute this week is about Calvin L. Rampton. Let's get started with our look back.
Kids out there, keep doing good things. Look for our officers. We have a lot of these coupons that we'll be handing out.
I wanted to acknowledge the importance of arts and what it does for us in our economy and what it does for us in this community.
Communities that support the arts and culture are investing in industries that support jobs, that generates government revenue, and is the cornerstone of tourism.
Whereas the Utah Arts Festival is the largest outdoor, multidisciplinary arts event in Utah, attracting nearly 80,000 attendees from across the state, nation, and globe. Now, therefore, I, Jacqueline M. Biskupski, Mayor of Salt Lake City, do hereby proclaim June 22nd through June 25th, 2017, as Arts Days in Salt Lake City.
The city maintains over 8,500 public property trees and plants over 800 neighborhood trees each year. The city's urban forester, Tony Glyott, has more.
I would say the first time I really started to have an appreciation for an interest in trees was at a very young age. I lived in a neighborhood in Illinois that was filled with oak trees and hickory trees, and we had a very large, probably 200-year-old oak tree in the front of our property. And I would play around the tree all the time, never thought anything of it as a 4, 5, 6-year-old kid. But then one day, probably when I was 7 or 8 years old, the tree was struck by lightning and essentially destroyed, and it had to be removed. And I remember thinking when that happened, even at 7 or 8 years old, what a loss that was to my life. It was the first time I probably looked at trees as something more than just a place to play. When I first was about to go to college, I didn't know necessarily what I wanted to do. I just knew that I didn't want to be in an office all the time, and I knew that I had a love of the outdoors and of nature. And I originally got into natural resource management, and then thankfully I had this wonderful college counselor who said, you should look into urban forestry and the care of trees for cities and urban spaces. And I had never heard of such a thing. I didn't realize that people actually could make a career out of that, but it sounded just like the perfect job for me. And I gravitated my career towards urban forestry and large-scale forest management at that point, and the rest is history. When you think of urban forestry, Mr. T probably isn't the first thing that comes to your mind. It's an interesting story because it's interesting to think that an inner city kid from that grew up in the projects of Chicago could have such a lasting and important impact on the way that cities and communities appreciate and seek to preserve trees. But Mr. T did just that inadvertently. He, in 1987, so 30 years ago this year, Mr. T was at the height of his career. He was a movie star and a TV star and kind of the pinnacle of his celebrity. So much so that he was able to purchase a beautiful mansion in one of the most affluent communities or neighborhoods north of Chicago. And he wasn't there very long before he realized that he didn't really like the forested character of his multi-acre estate. And he proceeded to cut down more than 100 mature trees. Some of them, many of them were oak trees that had been there more than 150 years. And it was that event that kind of galvanized the whole community and really the area to say, we need to do something to prevent this kind of tragedy from happening. Trees are that important to our city. And the city quickly drafted and adopted a tree protection ordinance, one of the strictest and first of its kind. And it's funny, it sounds like a little bit of a local story with local implications, but cities across the nation followed suit rather quickly, and now, today, 30 years later, urban forestry programs and tree protection ordinances are commonplace in municipalities that value the benefits that trees provide. Residents wishing to enlist the helpful services of the urban forestry program, whether that's planting a new tree or caring for an existing tree, can give us a call or visit our website. We'll be happy to help you out.
And now it's time for a History Minute.
Calvin Rampton was born in 1913, studied law at the University of Utah, and worked as an attorney while he began to run for offices in the state. He lost 6 elections in a row until he was elected